it takes a certain audacity to call yourself a shaman, and it's not always been easy for me. In fact, in the beginning, I was so excited when I realized, like, oh my gosh, I'm being called to the shamanic path. I get to become a shaman. It excited me. It felt like it finally explained something in me that had been there my entire life that I couldn't quite understand. And then I went and I was formally initiated, and I'm welcomed into the Kiro community up in the Andes, and I get to be a Paco in their society, and it felt great for about 2 years. And then all of a sudden, I felt like I was in a box calling myself a shaman. Part of that is like every time I said it out loud, it felt like a confession, like to be in line at the grocery store, or to be sitting on a plane, or to be at a party and someone's like, "Hey, so what do you do?" Like the most boilerplate innocuous question, and I have to say, "I'm a shaman." It was hard sometimes, and not because I was embarrassed to be a shaman, but because it was just instantly, it was like for the vast majority of people it would trigger something. And here's a few of the things it would trigger. On the one hand, you have people that think only indigenous people are shamans, so then instantly there's this strange disconnect where they look at you like either I'm stealing from their culture or I'm delusional. And then the next side of things is like the very atheistic, rationalistic person who looks at you and is like, "What are you talking about? Like that world doesn't exist. Like you're either a complete charlatan or you're a crazy person." And then there is, of course, if someone is religious, and I told them, then they looked at me with either like, hey, buddy, shamanism is outdated. Like Christ came, he laid down the new law. Like you're doing some weird, primitive, outdated thing. Or they would look at me like I was doing something demonic. And then there were people who would look at me like almost too accepting. Like I could say anything and they'd be like, "Oh, that's cool." But it never really connected to anywhere. It just kind of went right through, and then they were on to talking. And so I would like in some way confess something vulnerable, and then it wouldn't even matter. It would just and that sometimes was harder than the disapproval that I got from the other ones. And rarely, I would meet someone with an open mind who would be very curious and interested, or just be cool with it. And that was always great. But I felt trapped by that for a number of years. And in my head at the time, I told myself it was because what I did was larger than the title of shaman. Like people have all these associations, and what I did couldn't really be explained by that. But looking back, I can see that I just didn't want to deal with the occasional disapproval. And so there were times that I definitely hid what I did. And that was hard. That was really hard. What changed my mind is that I realized that my entire notion of what a shaman was wrong, really. And to explain that, I need to define what a shaman is. So there's really these 3 layers that people talk about when they talk about what a shaman is. First, you have like the archetype of a shaman, and then you have the anthropological study of shamanism, and then you have the practice of shamanism. So when most people explain shamanism, you hear them talk about it from an archetypical perspective, where they say, "Oh, the shaman is the precursor to the priest and the doctor and the astronomer and the philosopher. They were the first person to look out into the cosmos and try to make sense of it and understand what the cosmos was communicating back. And then they used that to try to help their society." That's true, but that's from an archetypical perspective. And to explain that, let's get into the other two, which is that from an anthropological perspective is where we get the word shaman. So Marcella Eliade, who he wrote the definitive book on shamanism, and in the first few pages he says like, oh, the term shaman comes from the term saman, which comes from Tunguska in Siberia. And basically what happens is that phrase saman was brought over by Dutch traders. It became shaman somewhere along the lines, and then anthropologists seized on that term to try to understand a collective human phenomenon. So when you're talking about shamanism from an anthropological perspective, really you're talking about an abstract study that is trying to investigate like these cross-cultural universals. So in shamanism's case, they're saying like, there are all these communities around the world that have this idea of soul loss or have this idea of possession or of power animals, these helpful nature spirits, or being able to talk to the local river or the mountain. And so what they did is they took all of these very, very, very different cultures and they distilled out the commonalities, and then they called that the study of shamanism. And so the key aspect for Marcel Eliade is he says that the shaman is different from the magician or the priest in a community because the shaman partakes in what he calls techniques of ecstasy, which for him is this idea that he says the shaman is believed to go into a trance and leave his body. So I would say that's the most widely understood definition of a shaman, where people say, oh, the shaman is the one who journeys into the spirit world. But what's really interesting is there was this Russian anthropologist, Shirka Gurov, before Eliade, and he was looking at it and he said, no, it's not the journeying, it's their mastery of spirits. In essence, like, they are great mediators. They're the ones who know who to talk to under what circumstances in the spirit world. And that's what makes them the shaman. The priest might say prayers out to the spirits, and the magician might try to do like a love potion or curse some other shaman and something, or curse some other magician even. But the shaman has this, their mastery is in navigating these relationships, which I think he's more right than Eliade. I mean, in the Andes where I've studied, they are absolutely shamanic communities, and they're not going in, like, they don't use psychedelics. They're not going into these trance states to do their work. They form these deep relationships with like the local apus, the local mountain spirits, and then that is what they call on for their ceremonies, to do their healings, to do their divinations, their coca leaf readings. I just think that's true. I think that a lot of people have this psychedelic view of shamanism where you're off journeying into other worlds, but it's just not necessary. If you can still talk, if you can still communicate with the spirits, you don't need to go anywhere. So that would be the anthropological study of shaman, or investigation into shamanism, which is that it purposefully gets rid of all the important aspects of culture. So like the Pacos that I've studied with in the Andes, like, being a Paco is their title. It comes with all sorts of cultural significance. There's a whole system to go into becoming a Paco. It's just baked into their entire society at every level. If you try to just distill it out and say like, oh, well, they call upon animals and they can do a soul retrieval, it's like misses the essence of a thing. And so that is true of every quote unquote shamanic society all around the world. It's the culture is as much a part of it as the things they're doing. So when you look at the practice of shamanism is really the implementation of the anthropological work that they've done. So it doesn't really have an overall culture and philosophy of its own. It's just saying, soul retrieval is real. Power animals retrievals are real. Possession is like, how can we do those things? And so that's why you see, myself included, and I didn't realize this at first, why so many people that practice shamanism go and study in an indigenous culture, because they actually still have like a functioning role in social understanding for this. They have a philosophy, they have a system of ethics and norms that what's often called like neo shamanism or the practice of shamanism that just doesn't have that. And a lot of people have filled that gap here in the West with like a bunch of just random hodgepodge, new age, some stuff from the East. This works and that works. And they've sort of created their own philosophy, which is fair. It's definitely better than nothing. But yeah, so the practice of shamanism in essence is like the Western standardization process. So aspirin comes from willow bark. We found willow bark. We get rid of all the other properties and we say, the one thing we can measure is this, and that turns into aspirin. So similarly with all sorts of supplements and things that come, like you're trying to find the one, Westerners in the standardization process are trying to find like the one potent measurable thing and then get rid of everything else. And so that's what the practice of shamanism is it's saying like, we're just going to take the very concentrated dose of this and we're going to get rid of everything else, which there are downsides to that. I mean, you see a lot of people now who are wise enough to say like, hey, I'm going to take a full spectrum extract. So if I'm going to take an herb, I want to take the concentrated part. I want to know that has is enough of a dose there, but then I want all the other properties of the plant, as long as they're not poisonous, of course. But I want all the other properties of the plant because I'm sure it supports it in ways that we don't understand and just haven't measured yet. So I want all of that. And so that is the trouble with the practice of shamanism. But that also points that like shamanism in essence, to call yourself a shaman is to call yourself a Western thing. Like shamanism is a Western invention. Really, it's going around the whole world and collecting everything up and saying, we're just going to use these few pieces. And shamanism in essence is pretty much a brand new thing because it's divorced from culture and it seeks to find thing like where in all of these shamanic societies, the things that they do like soul retrieval, destiny retrieval, divination, etc., like they spontaneously occurred to the society. That came to them. It, in a very Jungian sense, like it came from the collective unconscious and they implemented it. Whereas Westerners are implementing it off of an academic study. So it's a much more of an intellectual implementation of something, of saying like, all these other people are doing this thing. Let's pull that down into our own form. And so once I realized that, I'm like, shaman is the title in my society. And in my society, unfortunately, being a shaman, the reason I feel so weird about it is because it's not ingrained at all in my society. And that's what was causing me the problem. It wasn't just being misunderstood occasionally or having someone look down on me because of what I do. It was because there is no social wide understanding of what a shaman is, because it puts its weight on that academic study and in the academic field of the anthropological field of shamanism. Like what a shaman is technically always going to be up for debate. Like there are going to be people who think, Shirka Guroff is right or Eliot is right. And so what happens is it actually falls on everyone who practices shamanism to have their own definition. Because of course in our society, for there to be set standards, it has to become largely like a legal process or an organizing body if it's not legal. And both of those things don't exist. Like shamanism is the antithesis of that. It's every single person can really do what they want and do it in their own way. And that is the challenge, and why shamanism for the foreseeable future, it's hard to imagine it becoming better understood in our society, or at least maybe it will become better understood, but it won't to become integrated into our society. It's just hard to imagine because, again, anyone can call themselves a shaman with any meaning that they want to. So that's why I think it is so important if someone calls themselves that to explain what they do. So yeah, in my case, I agree with Shirka Gurov, mastery of spirits, but I also think the shaman has an ethical responsibility, and that is to be of service. And then I also think that there is an element there that goes along with the service, which is like the shaman is called. This whole very modern notion of like, I'm going to go dabble and play shaman for a little bit, I'm not a fan. I think that, yeah, it's like taking a sailboat out and to the ocean all by yourself if you've never sailed before. It's like, yeah, you know what? You might make it home. But if it gets stormy or anything goes wrong, like you're dabbling in things so far outside of your depth that it's just unwise. So, yeah. If someone calls themselves a shaman, ask them what they mean.